Hello, this lecture is on global exploration. In the 15th and 16th centuries, European explorers encountered new lands in the East and West. And of course, there was the discovery of the Americas. The incentive behind such activities varied. There was the pursuit of riches, the call to share the gospel, and the drive for adventure and experiencing new lands. All this led to conquest. The indigenous peoples of the Americas were vulnerable to European disease and technological superiority. Thomas Sowell reminds us that, quote, at one period of history or another, conquest has encompassed virtually all peoples, either as conquerors or victims, and the consequences have been wide-ranging as well. End of quote. From European expansion, a new era was ushered in that witnessed the rise and influence of Western Europe throughout the globe. But there was also cultural exchange that saw New World having a significant impact on the Old World. Although European ships of the exploration era were sturdy and seaworthy, they bobbed uncomfortably over the waves. Their sails carried them along slowly when the wind was behind them, but it was difficult to keep these ships on course when the wind was blowing in the opposite direction. There were vicious storms and sails had to be lowered to prevent the ship from overturning. With such conditions, it took many weeks to cross the Atlantic. The captain of a ship was usually aided by at least two officers who oversaw navigation and took care of the anchors, ropes, sails, and food. The work was divided among the crew, which included tradesmen who repaired and replaced parts of the ship. Because of the labor involved in sailing ships, they were often crowded. Usually, only the captain and the officers enjoyed a private, dry place to sleep. The crew spent all their time on the open deck. They worked, slept, and ate on the open deck. Ships carried food, but it was far from appetizing. Beans, hard biscuits, and heavily salted meats were the three main foods. In short time, drinking water became stale. On the sea, rainwater was collected. Wine was popular, but the bobbing of the ships usually caused leaks in the wine kegs. Reliable and full counts are scarce, but a general outline places the Norse as the first Europeans to contact the New World. The first immigrants had arrived thousands of years earlier from Asia across the Bering Strait land bridge. The Norse or Vikings were fierce people who lived in a region which is now Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Because Scandinavia consists of many inlets, water travel was the main form of transportation. In their time, the Viking people mastered shipbuilding. The keel that they added to ships resulted in a vessel which sailed much better than earlier ships. The Viking warship was approximately 80 feet long and 16 feet wide. The warship was propelled by both sail and oars. The Viking warriors were fearsome and cruel. Some especially fierce Vikings were called berserkers. One theory is that the consumption of mushrooms caused them to be so wild and fearless. In surprise attacks, they looted, murdered, and burned. As was the case with countless people groups throughout human history, They were a powerful people that stole land and goods from weaker people. They attacked England, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain, and Ireland. In 985, Eric the Red founded settlements in Greenland. In the year 1001, his son Leif Erikson explored the land west of Greenland and spent a winter in Vinland, located somewhere on the eastern coast of North America. This was the time of favorable climate change known as the medieval warm period. Erikson made no contact with other peoples, but his brother Thorvald encountered and killed 8 Skraelings. Now we know these being the Inuit people in another voyage. The first known European settlement was at L'Anse aux Meadows, located on the Great Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland. That was around the year 1000 AD, but it did not last, and there are no clear records indicating there were other Norse settlements. There were settlements in Greenland, but even they did not last beyond 1450. In the late 1400s, the Spanish scored great discoveries in the Western Hemisphere. Christopher Columbus, born in Genoa, Italy, was a mariner supported by Spain. He believed he could reach East Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic rather than east around Africa. The problem was that Columbus' calculation of the size of the globe was wrong. The world was much larger than what he thought. When he sailed across the Atlantic to the Caribbean in the year 1492, he believed that he had reached the East Indies. That is, he thought he had reached Asia and India. Thus, he referred to the people as Indians. The name America came later, originating from the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine merchant who later visited and wrote about the new lands. Columbus made 4 voyages discovering all the major islands of the Caribbean and present-day Honduras in Central America. But of course, he never returned to Spain with any samples of the fabled wealth of the Indies. He never made it to the Indies. Well, certainly the world changed as a result of his voyages. The huge Atlantic Ocean had long protected the indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere from the conquerors of the rest of the world. Well, that era was over. In 1519, Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan sailed to Brazil and then around the southern tip of South America to the Pacific Ocean. He found the strait that now bears his name at the southern end of South America. The door to the richest of the Americas was open for European expeditions. One major reason for the rise of Europeans on the world stage was their development of gunpowder weapons. Most of the early and slow-loading firearms were crude and inaccurate, but they unnerved the indigenous people who witnessed them for the first time. So, what was human life like in the Americas before the Europeans arrived? What was America like before Columbus? Before the arrival of Europeans to the New World, the population of the Americas was over 50 million, And some scholars suggest it was as large as 100 million. To put this in perspective, total world population was approximately 600 million. So the numbers then, if we looked at the Americas, approximately 1/6 of world population. The largest number of Aboriginal peoples lived in the South, in South and Central America. The land of today's United States had about 10 million people, and there was approximately 1 million people living in today's Canada. The native peoples were, quote, no more alike in their economic, cultural, military, or other achievements than the various peoples of Europe, Asia, or Africa had been. On the one hand, there were people such as the Aztecs who had large cities, and on the other hand, there were natives whose daily lives were quite primitive, living in temporary shelters and depending on their hunting and gathering skills for survival. Geography was important. The north and south trajectory meant major climate differences. While there were great highways that stretched from Asia to Europe, such as the Silk Road, there was nothing comparable in the Western Hemisphere. There were few north-south links, except a smaller version that connected the Incas in South America. The Iroquois in the north, for example, and the Aztecs of Central America were oblivious of the existence of each other. No native people in the Americas had the wheel, and none produced iron and steel. Interestingly, the Maya had wheels on toys that they made for children, but nothing for transportation. One explanation is that there was no pressing need for the wheel, since New World people had no horses, oxen, or other big animals to pull vehicles with wheels. Without the horse or the oxen, there was no animal muscle power to plow the land for agriculture. For the Americas, with farming, with agriculture, it was a whole culture. The work done with the land was done with hoes by the workers. There was no animals, larger animals plowing, or no animals used to plow the land. The historical record of non-literate peoples consisted of various drawings and oral stories. Except for the Maya, the peoples of the Americas were without any system of writing. So the Aztecs did not have writing, nor did the Incas have a system of writings. The early Europeans discovered that the indigenous people glorified military traditions. Also, the indigenous peoples enslaved other Indians. Typically, natives killed the men and captured the women, using them as slaves and concubines. In Central and South America, there were three major civilizations: the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas. The Maya civilization, located on the Yucatan Peninsula in Central America, was the only one with a developed written language and well-developed numbering system. The Maya had massive buildings and monuments and used volcanic glass called obsidian for tools. According to archaeologists, the civilization was at its strongest centuries before the arrival of the Europeans. Its rise was approximately in the year 250, and its fall was approximately the year 950. Despite its intellectual achievements, the Maya embraced war and violence. They systematized and celebrated torture and murder. Mayan art and writing depict the brutal torture of enemies with scenes of captured enemies cut out while alive. Human sacrifice took place, and victims included not only captured enemies, quote, but also adults and children killed to be buried with a Mayan leader, presumably to provide someone to look after their needs in the next world. The earliest known contact between the Mayan and Europeans was in 1511 when the Mayan captured survivors of a Spanish shipwreck and used them for human sacrifice. Cannibalism was common, and thus they ate the Spaniards in a feast. The Spanish only gained control of the Maya in the year 1546. Part of the delay was because there was no single government controlling all the Maya. Early Spanish military victories did not bring all the Maya under Spanish control. The Aztec civilization was further north in the Valley of Mexico, a mountain basin with an altitude of 7,000 feet. The Aztecs had urban centers, and they built aqueducts, canals, and drawbridges. Although they had no written languages, their pictographs provide important historical information. The main political ruler had great power. If a subject looked at him directly in the eye, they would be killed. The noble classes controlled the masses with restrictive laws. At the bottom of the social order were the slaves, sometimes used as substitutes for pack animals. The Aztecs, like the Maya, glorified military prowess. Aztec warriors took captured enemies and cut their hearts out of their living bodies on a high altar. Scholars estimate that tens of thousands of victims were sacrificed on Aztec altars. With the assistance of Indian enemies of the Aztecs, the Spaniards defeated the Aztecs at the island city of Tenochtitlan. Taking revenge against the Aztecs, who ate many of their people, Indian foes of the Aztecs killed and ate many of them in return. The Incas had a large empire that stretched more than 2,000 miles in South America. This included today's Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Bolivia, most of Colombia, and regions of Argentina and Venezuela. The Incas had an impressive highway system that was tens of thousands of miles long. The Inca nobility consisted of 40,000 who control the masses, numbering in the millions. The Inca rulers often relocated large numbers of people in order to populate recently conquered territories with politically reliable groups and disperse others to reduce the danger of insurrections. For religious rituals, there were the human sacrifices. Before there was contact with Europeans, the Incas experienced a devastating civil war. Now, leaving Central and South America and turning our attention to North America, in North America, the number of native peoples was much smaller than in South and Central America. The Eastern Woodland peoples were migratory, that is, hunters and fishers, and some of them were actually even semi-nomadic. Algonquin groups in the Northeast farmed, hunted, and fished. The Iroquois depended much more on farming for survival, particularly corn and beans. Their villages were stockaded and could house as many as 1,500 people. In the South, there were major centers. One trading center near St. Louis had a population, scholars believe, as high as 40,000. The Woodland Indians had access to more food than any other region in North America. As was the case elsewhere, there was intertribal conflict. When there were killing, the relatives of the victim were expected to avenge the murder by killing the suspected killer or someone related to the killer. Avenging murders were usually the reason for intertribal wars. Emotions ran high. In the Northeast, for example, an Iroquois captive was forced back to the enemy village where they were beaten, sometimes bitten, and pushed to run naked through a gauntlet of angry villagers. If one demonstrated courage, they might be adopted into the village. Those who did not measure up were further tortured and killed. Now, returning to the European explorations. Exploration to North America took place several years after Columbus. In the year 1497, Genesee's John Cabot, under the English, set out on the ship Matthew to find Japan. Again, not having an understanding of how large the globe was and thinking that one could sail directly westward and arrive at Japan. They just didn't realize there was a continent in the way. Well, Cabot found Newfoundland instead. Claiming the new land for England, Cabot and his men sailed homeward, convinced they had reached the shores of Asia. In England, Cabot spoke of the rich abundance of cod on the Grand Banks located near Newfoundland. With the fishery of the Great Banks a matter of public knowledge, the fishing industry began. And we have an increasing number of Europeans beginning in the early 1500s making their way to this rich fishery. The Portuguese and the French also made important expeditions to North America. In 1500, a Portuguese expedition captured 57 indigenous people and sent them back to Europe. Approximately 20 years later, the Portuguese settled on Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia, in today's Nova Scotia, but conflict with Indians resulted in the destruction of the colony. France paid greater attention to the North Atlantic in the years 1524 to 1542. The most notable expeditions were those of Jacques Karcher, who carried out 3 major voyages. In 1534, Karcher rounded the northern tip of Newfoundland and sailed down into the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Karcher's reaction to some of the land he observed was hardly optimistic. Quote, "I am rather inclined to believe that this is the land God gave to Cain." End of quote. He had a better impression of the eastern coast of New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island. The French made contact with natives in the Gaspe region before returning to France. The following year, they sailed up the St. Lawrence River to Stadacona, which is present-day Quebec City, and then a one-day visit to Hochelaga, today's Montreal, where there was a much more impressive native community of more than 1,000 people housed in 50 long houses. The French spent a long and cold winter at Stadacona, but suffered heavy losses due to scurvy. They learned from the natives that scurvy could be treated by a brew of bark and leaves, but this information came too late for many of the men. 25 men perished as a result of scurvy. When spring came, the French sailed for home with the chief Donnacona and 9 other natives, which in essence, these natives were used as exhibits for the royal court. Karcher returned in 1541 to start a colony, find gold, which reportedly was located farther inland, but as it turns out that they wasn't gold, it was probably copper deposits around Lake Superior. And also, in addition to starting a colony and find gold, was to find the Northwest Passage. Again, looking for that sea route to Asia, thinking that there was a passage in the north that one could reach Asia and not have to deal with this huge continent in the way. In the end, Karcher sailed home not with great riches, but with iron pirates and courts. And the courts, there's reference to this with the expression, quote, "fake as a Canadian diamond." So that sparkly material in quartz was not diamonds. Also, the colony under Karcher failed, as did an attempt the following year by Karcher's superior Roberval. Roberval met Karcher at St. John's and ordered him back to the St. Lawrence, but Karcher disobeyed. Without experience and adequate supplies, the Roberval party spent a miserable and deadly winter in Canada. Again, they too faced scurvy. The attempt at settlement in Canada had ended, at least for a number of decades. In fact, in the following decades, most of the European activity in the North Atlantic was fishing off the East Coast. The English, however, did make serious attempts later to find the Northwest Passage. Merchant Frobisher sailed in search of it in 3 voyages in the 1576 to 1578 years. Neither Frobisher nor John Davis 10 years later had any success. It was just too cold. There was just too much ice. There's no way that the sailing ships could ever possibly make their way through the Arctic to the Pacific Ocean. Due to distractions in Europe, settlement hardships in the New World, and lack of success in finding riches and the Northwest Passage to the Indies, European interest in Canada waned. It was sporadic for sure. There was no permanent European settlement in Canada until early in the 17th century. The Spanish, however, did establish the first permanent European settlement in present-day United States. That was the small military post of St. Augustine in the year 1565. Eventually, the English showed greater interest in colonization. One incentive was the push-pull issue of land. Land was becoming scarce in 16th century England, and the New World appeared to promise much. Another incentive was wealth. At the time, the economic system of mercantilism was adopted. It was believed that the world's wealth was finite. Thus, the key goal of a mother country was to export more to foreigners and import less and less from them. And the same would go with their colonies. The mother country would receive imports, raw materials. For example, for shipbuilding, the lumber, the trees that could make their way to the mother country would be good. And they, in return, there would be like finished products that the various colonies would need. And the whole idea is that the mother country would begin to accumulate and build up its source of money, its treasury, and this would also, in essence, give them a larger slice of the economic pie, because there is the idea, the belief that wealth is finite. A pie doesn't grow, it always stays the same. That pie of wealth stays the same, and what a nation wants to do is have a bigger slice of that pie. And a bigger slice of that pie means smaller slice for other countries. Well, this was according to the mercantile theory, then, colonies strengthened the mother country by providing a market for the mother country's manufactured goods and a source of supply for raw materials that the mother country could neither obtain nor produce at home. There was other motivations. There was the motivation for colonization included religion. The early pioneers of English colonization were Sir Humphrey Gilbert and Sir Walter Raleigh. In 1578, Gilbert obtained from Queen Elizabeth the exclusive right to inhabit and possess land in the New World. He claimed Newfoundland for England, as had Cabot done 100 years early, almost 100 years earlier, but he was lost to sea. Gilbert was lost to sea. His half-brother, Walter Raleigh, secured a similar grant from the Queen and landed on an island off the coast of North Carolina. He named the area Virginia in honor of Elizabeth, the, quote, Virgin Queen. At Roanoke, a colonization attempt ended in tragedy when the colonists perished without a trace. And this, to this day, remains a mystery. What happened to the people, the settlers of Roanoke? When Queen Elizabeth died in the year 1603, there was not one English person living in North America. Despite the Raleigh failure, other attempts of colonization began in the early 1600s, a century which would witness the start of all but one of the 13 North American colonies. That is, the American colonies, the 13 colonies. Only Georgia would be a colony that did not start in the 1600s, but actually started in the early 1700s. The growing contact between the Old World and New World, sometimes called the Colombian Exchange, certainly changed the human geography and natural environment of the world. The exchange was both beneficial and destructive. The Aboriginal peoples, quote, lived, died, and bred alone for generation after generation, developing unique cultures and working out tolerances for a limited Native American selection of pathological microlife, end of quote. With the arrival of Europeans, natives confronted their worst enemy, the invisible killers that the Europeans brought in their blood and breath. Diseases that the Europeans brought with them had a devastating effect. For example, the population of the Indians of Hispaniola, the island of Haiti and Dominican Republic, was about 100,000 when Columbus arrived. Less than 100 years later, the population was greatly reduced. Smallpox was the worst killer. It destroyed entire societies. Contrast to the tragedy of disease, the Colombian Exchange had some positive features. The exchange of crops were beneficial for millions. Honey was the main sweetener for early Europeans. There were few quantities of sugar. Rare in medieval Europe, it was sold in small pellets. Sugar cane was mainly grown in Arab lands, including Sicily. When the Portuguese began settling on Atlantic islands, they planted sugar cane. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese planted sugar cane in Brazil and then the West Indies. By itself, sugar constituted a whole economy. It became even profitable when molasses and rum were produced from it. Other crops and animals made the journey to the New World. European pigs, sheep, horses, cattle and chickens, honeybees, apples, peach, pear trees, and wheat thrived on new soil. So we got lots of important exchange unfolding. It should be stressed that the introduction of the horse had a major impact. The Aztecs were so amazed to see a man on horseback that they initially thought horse and rider was demonic. Europeans also transplanted from Asia white rice, coffee, bananas, and cotton. Some Native American crops were successfully transplanted in the Old World. Various indigenous people had relied heavily on potatoes, which were root vegetables that were rich in vitamins, easily grown, and could be prepared many ways. Potatoes soon became a staple of the European and African diet. Also, corn, tomatoes, yams, beans, squash, cashews, and cocoa beans traveled to Europe. On the matter of animals, the ungainly turkey was raised and consumed by Europeans. One crop that became part of European culture was tobacco. Europeans learned from Aboriginal peoples how to dry, age, and pulverize tobacco into a powder called snuff. This could be inhaled or shred into a coarse mixture that was smoked in pipes, cigars, or cigarettes. There were cigarettes as early as the 1500s, but they were not refined until the late 1700s. In time, the Colombian Exchange increased the world's population. When the Europeans brought wheat, horses, cattle, pigs, chickens, and other domestic animals to the Americas, the consequences were a large increase of food and animals. North American Indians specifically benefit greatly from the introduction of the horse. The Plains Indians especially adopted the horse into their culture. With the horses, the dog days were a thing of the past. The natives in North America had no domesticated animals except the dog, and in the Andes, the llama, which could be used as a pack animal, but not as a draft animal. So again, the point I made earlier that there was no plowing done with animal power. Wheat thrived in the plains of the Americas, and the stock of cattle and other domestic animals increased remarkably. American food crops also grew abundantly in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Corn, potatoes, beans, and tomatoes, for example, increased the nutrition of many peoples living in the world outside of the Americas. With the rise of calories, a greater number of people lived longer and in better health. There were three reasons for the European domination of the seas and global exploration. Well, let's look at technology. There was the technology of sailing ships. In the 15th century, European ships became much more sophisticated. Unlike earlier ships driven mostly by oars, sailing ships could travel much further. Sailing ships also became equipped with better sails and compasses, so navigation improved. The lateen sail was shaped to create a vacuum on its leeward side, effectively causing the vessel to be pulled along even when sailing very close to the wind. That's if you're going up against the wind with the way these sails would shift, you could keep going. Not as fast, obviously, if the wind was behind you, but still you would have movement. There was also the technology of guns, technical improvements of handheld guns, and guns, larger guns on board ships gave Europeans the necessary firepower to overcome rivals and non-European peoples. With powerful guns, the Europeans could build fortified trading posts to enhance and protect their interests. Also, we see the disease and how it, obviously a very sad story in how many people perished as a result of disease. The indigenous people in the Americas were helpless against the deadly microbes that the Europeans carried with them. So Europeans, even with their superiority with technology, with weapons and so forth, they just didn't have the numbers to defeat the native peoples. There was just too many. The imbalance, there was just far too many more indigenous people than Europeans. But with disease, so many of the indigenous people were wiped out. Now, reasons for exploration. I want to list a number of reasons for global exploration and expansion. Well, one I mentioned earlier was land. As the population grew in Europe, there was greater demand for land. Seeking land, Europeans turned to overseas exploration. Another reason was investments. Expeditions required money. Between the year 1450 and 1600, wealth increased in parts of Europe. And one result of this greater wealth was money for investment in costly explorations. Linked to this greater wealth was state assistance. That is, growing nation states, the emergence of nation states, sought to gain control of other lands, and they were much more willing to support expeditions, especially when exploration resulted in the discovery and accumulation of valuable minerals such as gold and silver. And this gets back to the concept of mercantilism. Another reason was the potential wealth from trade. Europeans wanted to reach the riches of Asia by sea, thus bypassing middlemen located in Eastern Europe and Western Asia. Spices from the East were especially sought after. Some spices acted as preservatives. And this was important because in Europe, there was a rise in domestic animals. When there was not enough fodder for the winter, cattle and other farm animals were slaughtered. If you can't feed the animals, why keep them? So they were slaughtered. Now, of course, the next step is how do you preserve the meat? To prevent spoiling, more preservatives were required. And that's where we get where spices could come in. Also, rotting foodstuffs was common for even wealthy families. Spices gave flavor to otherwise gross tasting meals. Some spices were used as perfumes to cloak the rotten odor that came into households from the filthy streets. Another major reason for exploration is Christianity. In his journal, Christopher Columbus explained his motive for his first expedition. Quote, "And your highness, as Catholic Christian and princess devoted to the holy Christian faith, resolved to send me, Christopher Columbus, to the said regions of India to see the said princes and peoples and lands, and to observe the disposition of them and of all, and the manner in which may be undertaking their conversion to our holy faith." Again, sharing the gospel. Columbus' strong faith was representative of much of European society. the desire to Christianize other peoples was a major incentive for exploration. And when a number of these Europeans saw what was happening with the Maya, the Aztecs, and Incas concerning human sacrifice, they saw the need even more so to share the gospel with these people. Another explanation for global expeditions, expansion, exploration was intellectual curiosity. Intellectual curiosity contributed to the desire to explore the world. Europeans began to look forward rather than backward. There was less attention to the achievements of the Greeks and Romans, who had been unaware of the existence of half of the world. So it was a bit of a wake-up call when the Europeans discovered that, going back to in the Renaissance period, how they were looking back at the Romans and the Greeks, and yet the Romans and Greeks didn't even know that half the world existed. So Europeans began to look forward, look ahead. Okay, just to sum up, in the end, global exploration changed the world. There was no turning back, as this period saw the rise of rapidly increasing global interaction and interdependence. Thank you.